Bob Harmon set his coffee mug on the porch railing, watching the last of the trick-or-treaters scatter like leaves down the street. First snow of the season drifted down, dusting the carved pumpkins that flanked his steps. Halloween had always been Margaret's favorite. Strange, she'd insisted on that church committee meeting tonight, of all nights. The knock came just as the neighborhood fell quiet. Not the rapid-fire knock of candy-seeking children, but 3 deliberate strikes against the oak. Through frosted glass, Bob made out a man's silhouette. Too tall for Pastor Allen, too broad for the mailman. When he opened the door, the smell of whiskey hit him before any words did. Jason Miles, their new neighbor, swayed slightly on the welcome mat, snow gathering on his expensive wool coat. "Mr. Harmon," Jason's voice cracked, "there's something you should know about Margaret and me." 35 years of marriage. One sentence about to shatter it all. "You better come inside." Bob stepped back, not from hospitality, but because some conversations shouldn't echo across a neighborhood. Snow whispered against the windows as he closed the door behind them. Jason stumbled slightly on the threshold. Everything about him seemed expensive. The coat, the watch, the haircut, everything except his composure. "Sit down before you fall down," Bob said, not unkindly. He'd seen enough drunks in his day to know when a man was running on fumes and regret. The younger man sank into the armchair Margaret had reupholstered last spring. His manicured hands trembled slightly. "I didn't plan this," Jason began, eyes fixed on the braided rug beneath his feet. "It just happened. Margaret and we've been seeing each other for months." Bob's coffee mug hung suspended halfway to his lips. A strange calm settled over him, like the moment before a controlled demolition. Everything still standing, but not for long. "Go on." His voice betrayed nothing. "The church committee meetings," Jason's words tumbled out faster now. "They weren't real. Sometimes we'd meet at my place, sometimes here, when you worked late." Bob set his mug down carefully on the side table. 35 years building something, and it takes less than 30 seconds for it to come down. "She has a key to your house," Bob said. A statement, not a question. Jason nodded miserably. "She gave me one, too." Outside, the snow fell heavier, muffling the world. Inside, Bob noticed his own hands, calloused, weathered, honest hands that had built half the structures in this town, including this very house, and compared them to Jason's soft ones. "How do you know I won't break your jaw right now?" Bob asked, voice level as a foundation. Jason glanced up, fear flickering across his face. "Because you're not that kind of man. Margaret said so." That cut deeper than the confession itself, that his wife knew him well enough to predict his restraint, to count on his dignity while planning its destruction. Bob moved to the window, watching snow build on the porch rail where jack-o'-lanterns grinned mockingly. Why tonight? Why the confession? Jason swallowed hard. "She's been moving money around. Asked me to help with some financial restructuring, said you were planning to divorce her anyway." Bob turned, something cold settling in his chest. "Financial restructuring. Your business holdings, property assets. She showed me papers from your office, deeds, account numbers. I'm a financial advisor, Mr. Harmon." "I know what you are." Bob's voice remained steady, though his world tilted beneath him. "And what are you advising these days? How to bleed a man dry before he knows he's cut?" Jason had the decency to look ashamed. "It went too far. I started feeling, when I realized what she was really planning, what she'd been doing with the will." "My will?" The words fell like stones. "She said you changed it years ago, but when I saw the signature..." Jason rubbed his face. "Look, I've been a fool, and worse. But you should know what's happening before it's too late." The sweep of headlights across the living room walls interrupted whatever Jason might have said next. Tires crunched on the snow-dusted driveway. Margaret's car. "That's her," Jason whispered, suddenly sober with panic. Bob straightened his shoulders, feeling every one of his 67 years. "You'll stay right where you are." The slam of a car door, footsteps on the porch, the familiar sound of Margaret's key in the lock, followed by the unfamiliar realization that the same key existed in another man's pocket. The door swung open. Margaret's smile froze as her eyes moved from Bob to Jason, comprehension dawning like a cold winter sunrise. "What's going on here?" she asked, voice honey-sweet but eyes sharp as broken glass. "Robert." Margaret stepped inside, shaking snow from her camel haircoat. "I wasn't expecting company." Her eyes cut to Jason, a question in them that went beyond surprise. "Jason stopped by," Bob said evenly. Seems he had something on his conscience. Margaret hung her coat with deliberate care, buying seconds. When she turned, her composure had solidified. What's this about? Jason opened his mouth, but Margaret sliced through whatever he might have said. Oh, Lord, she sighed, settling onto the sofa like she was taking a director's chair. Jason, have you been drinking? I thought we discussed this. Bob watched the performance unfold, almost admiring its craftsmanship. Robert, I'm so sorry about this. Her voice rippled with practiced concern. Jason's been going through a difficult divorce. I've been mentoring him through the church outreach program. Pastor Allen suggested it. She turned toward Jason, all maternal disappointment. But this isn't appropriate, showing up like this, especially in your condition. The snow beat a soft rhythm against the window panes. Outside, the world was disappearing under white. Inside, truth and lies swirled just as thick. Mentoring, Bob repeated, feeling the word's hollowness. He's been confused about the boundaries. Margaret's hand found Bob's forearm, squeezed gently, a gesture repeated thousands of times over decades, now foreign as a stranger's touch. I think he misinterpreted some of our conversations. Jason's face flushed. Margaret, that's not Jason, she interrupted, eyes flashing a warning Bob caught but pretended not to see. You're in no state to discuss this now. The roads are getting dangerous. Why don't you stay in the guest room until the plows come through? The plow's distant rumble sounded like thunder trapped under snow. I should go, Jason muttered, standing unsteadily. You'll wrap your car around a tree, Bob said. Guest room's down the hall, left side. Jason hesitated, then nodded woodenly and disappeared down the hallway. The click of the guest room door echoed in the sudden silence. Robert, I am so sorry about this, Margaret began, her voice lowered. He's been struggling. I had no idea he would. 35 years, Bob interrupted quietly. 35 years, and I've never once doubted your word. Margaret's eyes welled up perfectly on cue. And you shouldn't now. Later, after Margaret had gone to bed, Bob sat alone in his workshop off the garage. The small electric heater fought against the cold as he methodically disassembled and cleaned his father's old hand drill, a ritual that had always helped him think. Margaret's explanation hung together if you didn't look too hard. The church did have an outreach program. Pastor Allen might have suggested mentorship. Jason was going through a divorce, according to the hardware store gossip. But there was the matter of Jason knowing about their finances, about the will, the matter of that look that passed between them, quick as a card sharp's tell, but just as revealing if you were watching for it. Bob worked the oil into the drill's gears, his mind turning just as methodically. 35 years, built a life together, a business, a home. 35 years meant something, but so did the truth. When he finally came to bed, Margaret reached for him in the darkness. I love you, she whispered. Nothing happened with Jason, you believe me, don't you? Let's talk in the morning, Bob said, settling on his side of the bed, the space between them wider than the inches suggested. For the first time in their marriage, he lay awake while she slept, listening to the rhythm of breath that had been his nighttime companion for decades, now sounding somehow unfamiliar. The snow continued through the night, burying the Halloween pumpkins completely. By morning, the plows had cut narrow channels through the streets. Jason mumbled awkward thanks and fled as soon as the roads were passable. Good riddance, Margaret said, watching from the window as his expensive car fishtailed down the drive. Robert, about last night. Bills need paying, Bob interrupted, spreading the monthly statements across the kitchen table. Might as well get to it while we're snowed in. Margaret hovered uncertainly, then busied herself making fresh coffee. Bob worked through the stack methodically. Electric, water, property taxes. When he reached their joint bank statement, he paused. A withdrawal of $12,000 on the 15th. He couldn't recall making it. Margaret, he called, keeping his voice conversational. Did you make a withdrawal 2 weeks back? 12,000? The coffee pot clattered against the counter. Oh, that, yes, I meant to tell you. The church roof fund. I wrote it down somewhere. Seems like something I'd remember, Bob said, watching her face. Think I'll call Jim at the bank. Double-check a few things. Maybe Tom Sanders, too. Haven't had our accountant look over things in a while. Margaret's smile tightened. Is that really necessary? Tom charges by the hour, and for what? We've been managing fine. Just being thorough. Bob folded the statement carefully. Never hurts to have another set of eyes. That evening, while hanging Margaret's coat after her quick trip to the grocery store, Bob felt something hard in the pocket. A key. Not to their house, not to her car. New, recently cut, with no identifying marks. He held it up to the light, then walked to the window. Across the street, through the falling snow, he could just make out Jason's house. Dark now, its owner mysteriously absent after his hasty morning departure. Bob closed his fingers around the key, its teeth biting into his palm. The hardware store hadn't changed since Bob's father used to bring him here as a boy. Same wooden floors that creaked in the same places, same smell of sawdust and metal. Even Walt Simmons hadn't changed much in 30 years. Just grayer, a little stooped, but with the same no-nonsense manner that had made him Bob's first hire when Harmon Construction was just a pickup truck and a toolbox. "Figured I'd find you here," Bob said, finding Walt restocking hammers in the back aisle. Walt glanced up, then around to make sure no one was within earshot. "Been wondering when you'd come by. Coffee?" 5 minutes later, they sat in Walt's small office behind the storeroom. A space heater hummed in the corner, fighting the draft from the loading dock. Walt poured coffee from a thermos into 2 chipped mugs. "So, how long have you known?" Bob asked, no accusation in his voice. Walt's weathered face creased with discomfort. "Suspected for about 2 months. Knew for sure 3 weeks ago when I was fixing her car. Saw them at the Lakeside Motel when I was coming back from the parts store." Bob nodded, absorbing this with outward calm. "You could have told me." "Would've, if it kept going." Walt met his eyes directly. "Wasn't sure it wasn't just, hell, Bob, 35 years. Figured maybe it would pass." "Not just an affair." Bob sipped the bitter coffee. "Money's involved. Documents from my office." Walt's expression hardened. "Damn." He set his mug down with deliberate care. "Martha's been on my case about some papers she found when she was cleaning at your place last week. Said they didn't seem right, but she didn't want to cause trouble." "What papers?" "In Margaret's desk. Martha wasn't snooping. Drawer was open when she was dusting. Something about property transfers, changes to your will. She thought Margaret might be surprising you with some kind of estate planning." Bob felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. "I need to see those papers, Walt." The snow had stopped, but the temperature had plunged, turning everything to ice. Bob's truck heater couldn't keep up as he and Walt drove across town to the Simmons' modest ranch house. Martha Simmons met them at the door, anxiety written across her face. "I should have said something sooner," she fretted, leading them to the kitchen table where a folder lay waiting. "You're saying something now," Bob assured her. "That's what matters." The contents of the folder told a story clearer than any confession. Copies of property deeds with transfer documentation partially completed, a draft of a revised will leaving everything to Margaret, with Bob's signature that looked right at first glance but wasn't quite his, account statements from banks Bob had never used. "This is," Walt started. "Methodical," Bob finished, his voice steady despite the roiling beneath. "This wasn't impulse. This was planned." Martha twisted her dish rag. "There's something else. That Jason fella? I have a niece who works at First National over in Rockport. Said they had trouble with him, some kind of investigation about elder financial advice. Nothing stuck, but he left town right after." Bob carefully returned the documents to the folder. "Financial advisor with a history, and our new neighbor, by coincidence." Walt's face darkened. "No such thing as coincidence that convenient." "I need to get some papers from my office," Bob said, standing, "and make copies of these." "Use my workshop out back," Walt offered. "Got a copier for the store paperwork. Nobody goes in there but me. And I need somewhere safe to keep the originals." Walt nodded grimly. "Tom Harrison at the bank. He'll open the vault on a Sunday for you." By late afternoon, Bob had secured his original documents in a new safety deposit box Tom Harrison had discreetly provided. The copies were safely stored in Walt's workshop, which now served as an impromptu command center. Bob sat near the window, a thermos of coffee at his elbow, watching his own house across the park. "You're sure Margaret doesn't know you found these?" Walt asked, organizing the evidence into labeled folders. "She thinks I'm helping the Miller boy with his Eagle Scout project." Bob didn't take his eyes from the window. "She's been checking her phone every 5 minutes since I found that key. Something's coming to a head." "You could confront her now," Walt suggested. "We've got enough." Bob shook his head. "Not yet. I need to understand how deep this goes." The distant sound of a car engine drew their attention. A sleek black sedan pulled up to Bob's house. Jason Miles stepped out, looking over his shoulder before approaching the front door. "Son of a bitch," Walt muttered. From their vantage point, they watched as Jason produced a key from his pocket, the same key Bob had found in Margaret's coat. With practiced ease, Jason unlocked the door to Bob's home and slipped inside. "Well," Bob said, his voice like winter, "that answers one question." "What now?" Walt asked. Bob's weathered hands clenched once, then relaxed. "Now we find out exactly who Mr. Jason Miles is, and what he and my wife are planning next." Through the workshop window, Bob watched his house, the home he'd built with his own hands, the life he'd constructed over decades, now infiltrated by strangers. The betrayal was no longer just to his marriage, but to everything he'd built. "Tom mentioned something about Jason's previous town," Bob said quietly. "Think it's time we made some calls." Days bled together in Walt's workshop. Bob had created a makeshift living space in the back, a cot, a hot plate, and a card table covered with financial records spanning 30 years of careful building. The cold snap following the Halloween snow showed no signs of breaking. Bob's breath clouded in front of him as he scanned bank statements, property assessments, and business holdings, assembling a picture of what Margaret and Jason were after. "Got something," Walt announced, entering with a blast of cold air. He tossed a folder on the table. "Friend at the county clerk's office in Rockport. Jason Miles worked at Somerset Financial for 18 months. 2 complaints filed by elderly clients, funds transferred without proper authorization. Firm settled quietly, records sealed. Bob nodded, unsurprised. "Pattern. There's more. He's not just a financial advisor. He specializes in wealth transfer for high net worth clients." Walt tapped the folder. "Means he helps rich folks move money around, usually avoiding taxes or bypassing spouses," Bob finished. The workshop's small space heater clicked and hummed, fighting a losing battle against the cold. "Any luck with the property searches?" "Records show he bought his house 3 months ago, paid cash." Walt's expression hardened. 3 weeks after Margaret made that solo trip to her sister's. Bob absorbed this with quiet dignity, though each revelation felt like a physical blow. He turned to the window, resuming his surveillance of his own home across the snow-covered park. "You can't keep living like this, Bob," Walt said quietly. "Spying on your own house, sleeping on a cot in a freezing workshop. Got nowhere better to be." The words came out flatter than intended. A movement across the park caught his attention. Margaret, emerging from the house, phone pressed to her ear, gesturing animatedly. Even from this distance, Bob could read the tension in her posture. "She's getting nervous," he observed. "Been calling the bank every day, according to Tom, trying to access the business accounts." Walt snorted. "Tom's not giving her a damn thing without your signature. She'll find another way." Bob didn't take his eyes off his wife. "She's resourceful, always has been." The next morning, Bob drove his truck into town for supplies. The diner on Main Street had been his breakfast spot for 30 years, a routine he maintained now for appearance and intelligence gathering. The bell above the door jangled as he entered. Conversation dimmed, then resumed with artificial normality. Bob nodded to the familiar face, noting which ones met his eyes and which suddenly found their coffee fascinating. "Usual, Bob?" Doris asked from behind the counter. "Please." He took his regular booth by the window. A minute later, his coffee arrived, black, no sugar, accompanied by Doris's sympathetic smile that told him she knew something but wouldn't say what. Outside, children were taking advantage of the snow, sledding down the small hill in the town square. Bob watched them as he ate his eggs and toast, the simple pleasure a welcome distraction from his troubles. As he was finishing, a commotion drew his attention. A small boy was crying, pointing up at the old oak tree where a toboggan had somehow lodged in the higher branches. Bob left cash on the table and walked outside. The boy, couldn't be more than 7, looked up with tear-streaked face. "That your sled up there, son?" Bob asked. The boy nodded miserably. "My grandpa made it." Bob studied the tree, then walked to his truck and retrieved a coil of rope. "What's your name?" "Tyler." "Well, Tyler, let's see if we can get it down." It took 20 minutes of careful work, Bob's old joints protesting as he secured the rope around a lower branch and used it to dislodge the toboggan. When it finally came free, Tyler's face lit up like Christmas morning. "Thanks, Mr. Harmon." The boy hugged the wooden sled. "You're welcome." Bob coiled his rope with methodical precision. "Be more careful about those jumps you're building. Trajectory matters." "Yes, sir." Bob turned to find several parents watching. Their expressions carried something he couldn't quite name. Appreciation, certainly, but also something like assessment. Weighing, judging. Margaret's whisper campaign had begun. Back at Walt's workshop, Bob was reviewing copies of his will when Walt burst in. "She's been at the courthouse," Walt reported, stomping snow from his boots. "Martha's cousin works in records, says Margaret was asking about property liens, transfer procedures without co-owner signatures." Bob nodded grimly, getting desperate. "There's something else," Walt hesitated. "She's been telling people things. About you." "What things?" "That you've been forgetting things, getting confused, that she's worried about your mental state." Walt couldn't meet his eyes. "She had lunch with Pastor Allen yesterday, crying about how she doesn't know how to help you through this difficult transition in your life." The pieces clicked into place, setting the stage to challenge my competency if needed. "Bob, people are talking, not everyone, but enough." The workshop suddenly felt smaller, colder. Bob turned back to the window, watching as lights came on in his house across the darkening park. In the reflection, he could see his own face, lined, weathered, but clear-eyed. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Unknown number. "Hello?" A pause, then a voice he hadn't heard in over 2 years. "Dad, it's Michael." Bob's hand tightened on the phone. His son, calling out of the blue after their last bitter argument. This couldn't be coincidence. "Michael," he acknowledged, keeping his voice neutral. "Been a while." "I got a call from Mom," Michael said. "She's worried about you, says you've been acting strange, staying away from home." A hesitation. "She thinks you might be having some cognitive issues." Bob closed his eyes briefly. So that was Margaret's next move, bringing their estranged son into this. "I'm coming to town," Michael continued. "We need to talk." The hardware store's upstairs apartment had been vacant since Old Man Jenkins moved to Florida 3 years back. Now it served as Bob's temporary sanctuary, a single room with a kitchenette, bathroom, and a view of Main Street's Christmas preparations beginning below. The knock came precisely at noon. Bob opened the door to find his son standing there, looking every inch the successful attorney he'd become. Michael Harmon had his father's height and his mother's features, but the wariness in his eyes belonged to neither parent. "Dad." Michael stepped inside, surveying the sparse quarters. His expression revealed nothing. "Good to see you, son." Bob meant it, despite the circumstances. "Coffee?" "No thanks." Michael remained standing, briefcase clutched like a shield. "Mom says you've been living here for days, says you've been acting erratic, paranoid." Bob poured himself a cup from the percolator, the familiar gurgle filling the awkward silence. "What else does she say?" "That you're forgetting things, making accusations, that she's worried about early dementia." Michael's clinical tone couldn't quite hide his concern. "She's talking about having you evaluated." Bob nodded, absorbing this. Through the window, he could see the town Christmas tree being erected in the square, men in work clothes carefully guiding the massive pine into position. "Your mother's always been thorough," he said finally. Michael frowned. "That's it? You're not going to deny it?" "Would it matter if I did?" Bob sipped his coffee. "You flew 1,000 miles on her word. My denial won't undo that." "Something's obviously wrong," Michael countered, gesturing around the apartment. "People don't abandon their homes after 35 years of marriage for no reason." Bob set his cup down carefully. "You're right about that." He walked to a small desk where several folders lay neatly arranged. "Before we get into anything, I'd like to know something. Why'd you really come, Michael? Because your mother called? Or because you wanted to?" The question hung in the air between them, bridging years of strained silence. Michael's shoulders dropped slightly. "Both, I suppose." She sounded convincing, but I also thought, he faltered. "It's been too long." Bob nodded. "On that, we agree." Fresh snow crunched beneath their boots as Bob walked Michael through town. The temperature had risen just enough to make the air feel crisp rather than biting. Bob pointed out new developments alongside old landmarks. "You built half this town," Michael observed as they passed the library Bob's company had renovated a decade ago. "Just the important half," Bob replied with the hint of a smile. As they walked, Bob noticed how townspeople reacted, some offering hearty greetings, others giving uncertain nods, a few whispering behind gloved hands. Michael noticed, too. "Doesn't seem like a town that thinks you're losing your mind," he said quietly. People make up their own minds around here. They stopped at the diner for lunch. Doris brought their orders without being asked. Bob's usual, and to Michael's surprise, the turkey club he'd favored as a teenager. You remember, Michael said, startled. Some things stick. Bob salted his eggs. Your graduation speech. That case you won in Boston 3 years back. Your mother keeps the newspaper clipping in her drawer. Something flickered across Michael's face. She said you two barely communicate anymore. That you're distant, withdrawn. Did she mention Jason Miles? Bob asked mildly. Michael's fork paused halfway to his mouth. The financial advisor helping with your estate planning. She mentioned him, yes. Bob nodded, saying nothing more as he finished his meal. The diner window framed the Christmas lights being strung across Main Street, workers balancing on ladders while children watched from below. After a moment, Michael continued, voice lower. She said he's been very helpful, that you've been resistant to necessary planning. Resistant, Bob echoed. That's one word for it. As they were leaving, Tyler, the toboggan boy, rushed up with his mother in tow. Mr. Harmon, I made it down Dead Man's Hill, the boy announced proudly. Careful with that sled, Bob cautioned with a wink. It's built to last. Thank you again for your help, Tyler's mother said, warmly. Not many would have taken the time. After they left, Michael studied his father. Dead Man's Hill was my favorite sledding spot. Still got the scar on your chin to prove it, Bob replied. Margaret's face registered surprise, then delight, when they entered the house later that afternoon. She embraced Michael tightly before turning a concerned expression toward Bob. Robert, I'm so glad you came home, she said, voice honeyed with relief. I've been so worried. The house smelled of cinnamon and apples. Margaret's signature pie in the oven, a peace offering or a prop. Bob couldn't tell anymore. Michael wanted to see the house, he explained simply. Of course, of course. Margaret bustled around, playing the perfect hostess. I've kept everything just as it was. Your father's been going through a difficult time. The three of them settled in the living room, decades of family history watching from photo frames while Margaret outlined her concerns to Michael, Bob's forgetfulness, his suspicious nature, his paranoid accusations about financial matters. I think we need to revisit the arrangements we made, she said gently, for your father's protection. Jason has some excellent suggestions for restructuring assets. I'd like to see the existing documents first, Michael responded, lawyer mode engaged. A flash of something crossed Margaret's face before smoothing into concern. Of course, they're in your father's office, though some may be disorganized. Robert's filing system has become rather challenging lately. While Margaret fetched the papers, Michael leaned toward his father. She seems genuinely worried. Your mother's always been convincing, Bob replied. Margaret returned with a leather portfolio. Here's everything, the will, property deeds, account information. Jason helped me organize it all. Michael began reviewing documents methodically. Bob watched in silence, noting his son's expression changing subtly as he progressed through the pages. When he reached the revised will, Michael stared at the signature for a long moment, then looked up at his father. Dad, he said carefully, did you sign this? Let me see. Bob took the document, examined it, then handed it back. What do you think? Michael compared it with other paperwork, then set the will aside. I think we need to talk, privately. Margaret's smile faltered. Michael, whatever you're thinking. Mom, Michael interrupted gently but firmly. I need to speak with Dad. Alone. The look that passed between father and son contained the first fragile thread of restored trust. You never told me you were a lawyer, Bob said, when they were alone in his office, the door firmly closed against Margaret's hovering presence. Michael loosened his tie, looking more like the boy Bob remembered than the polished professional who'd arrived. You never asked. After our fight about the business, he trailed off, old wounds still tender. Water under the bridge, Bob said, though they both knew bridges needed maintenance too. Michael spread the documents across the desk. This signature isn't yours. Close, but the pressure points are wrong, and you don't loop your H that way. He looked up, all business now. And these property transfers, they're backdated, but only partially executed. Someone's been setting up a complex series of movements. Your mother's new friend is thorough. Jason Miles. Michael's expression hardened. The financial advisor helping with estate planning, among other things. Bob kept his voice neutral, watching his son process the implications. Michael paced the small office, lawyer's mind assembling facts. How long have you known? Halloween night. He showed up drunk, confessed the affair. Then I started finding financial discrepancies. Jesus, Michael ran a hand through his hair. And you've been investigating since then? Living above the hardware store? Bob nodded. Had some help. Walt Simmons, mainly. The hardware store owner? The guy who taught me how to change a bike chain? Same one. Bob hesitated, then added, I've got copies of everything secured elsewhere. Originals in a new safety deposit box your mother doesn't know about. Michael stared at him, something like respect dawning. You've been 3 steps ahead this whole time. Meanwhile, Mom's setting you up to look incompetent. He shook his head. She called me because she needs access to the trust holdings. Said you were refusing necessary updates. Necessary for whom? Bob asked mildly. A moment of silence stretched between them as decades of misunderstanding began to dissolve in the face of clear evidence. I should have called more, Michael said finally. After Mom said you were struggling with retirement memory issues, I should have checked directly. We both could have picked up the phone, Bob acknowledged. But we're here now. Michael squared his shoulders in a gesture so like Bob's that neither noticed the similarity. What do you need from me? Legal perspective. Careful documentation. Bob looked his son in the eye. And maybe a second chance to get some things right between us. For the first time since arriving, Michael smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. I think we can arrange that. The courthouse stood at the center of town, its brick facade and white columns a testament to permanence. Bob had renovated the east wing 15 years earlier, replacing rotted support beams that dated back to 1889. Mrs. Gaines, Bob greeted the elderly clerk behind the records counter. Appreciate you making time. Eleanor Gaines had been manning the courthouse records since before Bob built his first house. Her silver hair was pulled into the same tight bun she'd worn for 40 years, reading glasses perched on a beaded chain. Robert Harmon, she said warmly, and this must be young Michael. My, how you've grown. Mrs. Gaines was the first homeowner to hire Harmon Construction, Bob explained. 1978, foundation repair turned into a complete rebuild. Best investment I ever made, Eleanor declared. That house has weathered 3 floods and a tornado while others washed away. She lowered her voice. Now, what can I help you with? Martha Simmons mentioned you might be needing some records. Michael produced a list. Property transactions, deed transfers, any filings under these names and dates. Eleanor scanned the paper, lips pursing. I see. Well, the public access computers are down for maintenance. You'll have to use my terminal in the back. Might take an hour or two without interruption. She winked conspiratorially. I'm due for my lunch break anyway. As she gathered her purse, she placed a weathered hand on Bob's arm. This town has a long memory, Robert. Longer than some folks realize. After she left, Michael looked at his father with new appreciation. You've got allies everywhere. Built something solid for people they tend to remember, Bob replied simply. They spent the afternoon piecing together a paper trail that revealed the scope of the scheme. Property transfers prepared but not completed, financial movements designed to isolate assets, a clear pattern of planning. There's more, Michael said, scrolling through records. This Jason Miles has a history. Similar situations in 2 other states, always with older wealthy clients. Usually married couples where one spouse becomes marginalized. The winter sun was setting early when Bob's phone rang, Walt's number flashing on the screen. You need to get back here, Walt said without preamble. That Miles fella just walked into the hardware store asking for you. Said he wants to talk about mutually beneficial arrangements. On my way, Bob replied, motioning to Michael. As they gathered their notes, Bob felt a strange calm settling over him. The confrontation he'd been preparing for was finally at hand. The hardware store's front bell jangled as Bob and Michael entered from the biting cold. Jason Miles stood near the register, dressed in a cashmere overcoat that seemed deliberately out of place among the hammers and drill bits. His confident smile faltered slightly at the sight of Michael. Mr. Harmon, Jason recovered quickly. I was hoping we might have a word. In private. Walt emerged from behind a display of snow shovels, arms crossed over his chest like a sentinel. Back office is available, he offered, eyes never leaving Jason. That won't be necessary, Bob replied evenly. Anything you need to say can be said in front of my son. Jason's gaze flicked between them, reassessing the situation. The late afternoon light through the frosted windows cast long shadows across the worn wooden floor. I'm simply trying to help resolve a difficult situation, Jason said, lowering his voice to a confidential tone. Margaret is concerned about your judgment lately. These accusations, this paranoia, it's creating unnecessary strain. Paranoia, Bob repeated, the word hanging in the air like frost. Moving out, hiding documents, making wild claims about financial improprieties. Jason's tone was reasonable, concerned, a performance for the few customers browsing nearby. At your age, these confusion episodes are not uncommon. Michael stepped forward. Mr. Miles, I'm Michael Harmon, Robert's son and attorney. Perhaps we should discuss your fiduciary relationship with my mother, including the altered will and backdated property transfers? The confidence in Jason's eyes flickered, but his smile remained fixed. I'm simply advising Margaret on standard estate matters, at her request, and your father's initial approval. Funny thing about approval, Bob said, his voice calm as still water. It generally requires actual signatures, my signatures. Something hardened in Jason's expression. You might want to consider your options carefully, Mr. Harmon. Contested competency hearings can be messy, public affairs, your reputation in this town, your business legacy, these things are valuable. Would be a shame to see them tarnished over a misunderstanding. The threat hung in the air, clear as the icicles outside the window. Bob didn't flinch. I've spent 67 years building things that last, Mr. Miles. How about you? Jason straightened his expensive coat. Think about what I've said. There are still arrangements possible that could benefit everyone involved. His eyes narrowed slightly. But time is running short. After he left, the bell's cheerful jingle, a discordant note, Walt spat into a nearby trash can. Snake oil salesman in a $1,000 suit. Michael was grim. He just threatened Dad with a competency challenge. While suggesting a payoff to avoid it, Bob added, man doesn't know when to fold a bad hand. Back at Walt's workshop, they found Martha waiting with a large envelope, her expression caught between disgust and triumph. Got these from Jason's trash, she announced without preamble. Been collecting his garbage since Walt told me what was happening. Figured there might be something worth finding. Michael raised an eyebrow. That's technically illegal, Mrs. Simmons. So's trying to rob a good man blind, she retorted, unrepentant. Besides, trash at the curb is public property according to Judge Judy. The envelope contained crumpled documents, draft transfer papers with handwritten notes in the margins, a discarded printout of Bob's financial holdings, and most damning, a hastily sketched timeline labeled H Liquidation Schedule. H for Harmon, Walt said grimly. Michael spread the papers across the workshop table. This is the smoking gun. He's got a whole exit strategy planned. Asset liquidation, offshore transfers. He pointed to dates scribbled in the margin, and a deadline, December 20th. The week before Christmas, Bob noted. Appropriate, in its way. While Michael organized the new evidence, Walt pulled Bob aside. There's more. Tom at the bank did some digging. Jason Miles worked in Springvale before moving here. Similar situation. Wealthy older couple, wife suddenly filing for power of attorney over husband's assets, financial advisor facilitating. Husband had a stroke during the proceedings. Convenient timing. Bob absorbed this with quiet anger. Any charges? Nothing stuck. Husband died. Wife took everything. Miles moved on. Walt's face was grim. Patterns clear as day. And Margaret? Bob couldn't keep the question inside anymore. How deep is she in this? Walt hesitated. Hard to say. Could be a willing partner. Could be she's being played to. Jason's type targets vulnerabilities, fear of aging, financial insecurity, marital dissatisfaction. Bob nodded, thoughts turning to the decades of marriage now revealed as more complex than he'd understood. The workshop's small heater ticked and hissed, fighting against the deepening cold outside. As evening fell, snow began again, heavy flakes swirling in the yellow glow of the street lamps. Weather reports warned of another 8 inches overnight. Michael watched the darkening sky with concern. If this keeps up, they'll have to postpone the town Christmas gathering tomorrow. That would complicate things, Bob replied, reviewing their assembled evidence. The town gathering represented their best opportunity for a controlled confrontation, neutral ground with key community members present. Michael turned from the window. We've got enough to take to the authorities now, Dad. Wire fraud, elder financial abuse, document falsification. And then what? Bob interrupted quietly. Months of investigation while they drain what they can. Public spectacle. Margaret in jail. He shook his head. There needs to be a reckoning, but on my terms. She betrayed you, Michael said, a son's protective anger in his voice. Tried to destroy everything you've built. 35 years, Michael. That counts for something, even now. Michael studied his father, understanding slowly dawning. This isn't just about the money for you. Never was. Bob arranged the documents with careful precision. It's about truth, consequences, and walking away with dignity intact. They worked late into the night, organizing evidence, preparing documentation packets, and planning their approach. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the town in silent white. Morning brought clear skies and bitter cold. The town plows had worked through the night, clearing streets for the Christmas gathering that evening. Bob stood before the small mirror in Walt's workshop, adjusting his tie with practiced movements. On the workbench lay several sealed envelopes, each containing copies of key evidence labeled for specific people: Pastor Allen, Tom Harrison from the bank, Judge Whitaker, who would attend the gathering. Michael entered, carrying coffee in a garment bag. Picked up your good suit from the house while Mom was at her hair appointment. He set down the coffee. Everything's ready. Walt will handle distribution at the gathering. Bob nodded, studying his reflection. The face looking back had aged more in the past weeks than in the previous decade, lines deepened by betrayal and resolution. Dad, Michael said hesitantly, whatever happens tonight, I want you to know I'm proud of how you've handled this. Most men would have broken something or someone. Breaking things is easy, Bob replied, straightening his shoulders. Building takes patience. So does justice. The workshop phone rang, Walt calling to confirm the gathering was proceeding as scheduled. The time had come to bring everything into the light. As they prepared to leave, Bob paused at the door, looking back at the evidence they'd meticulously assembled. The proof of betrayal, the documentation of decades built and nearly lost. Ready? Michael asked. Bob nodded, resolve settling around him like a well-worn coat. Time to finish what they started. St. Mary's Church Fellowship Hall glowed with Christmas cheer, pine garlands draped along wood-paneled walls, red candles flickering on linen-covered tables. The annual town Christmas gathering had been a tradition for decades, a moment when the community came together before the holiday rush. Bob stood in the entrance, Michael and Walt flanking him like sentries, his charcoal suit and burgundy tie, the same he'd worn to every important occasion for 20 years, felt like armor. They're both here, Walt murmured, nodding toward the far corner where Margaret held court among the church ladies. Her silver blue dress caught the light as she laughed, hand touching Pastor Allen's arm for emphasis. Nearby, Jason worked the room with practiced charm, navigating between the town's business owners and elected officials. Judge Whitaker just arrived, Michael noted. Bank president, too. Perfect timing. Bob buttoned his suit jacket. Let's begin. The three men separated, each with specific assignments. Walt carried a leather portfolio containing identical sealed envelopes. Michael positioned himself near the refreshment table, establishing a casual presence while keeping Margaret and Jason in his sightline. Bob moved through the room, shaking hands, exchanging pleasantries, the picture of a respected community member. The old radiators hissed and clanked, fighting against the December chill that seeped through leaded glass windows. The smell of pine boughs mingled with cinnamon punch and beeswax candles. Christmas carols played softly from hidden speakers, creating a gentle backdrop for dozens of overlapping conversations. Margaret spotted Bob, her smile faltering momentarily before brightening with artificial warmth. She whispered something to Pastor Allen before moving to intercept her husband. "Robert," she greeted, voice honeyed with public concern. "I'm so glad you came. I've been worried." "Margaret," he acknowledged with a slight nod. "Beautiful gathering as always." "We should talk privately," she suggested, placing her hand on his arm. "There are some matters." "Soon," Bob promised, gently disengaging. "Need to say hello to Judge Whitaker first." Across the room, Walt moved with purpose, stopping briefly beside the judge, then Tom Harrison from the bank, then the mayor. Each conversation ended with a discreet envelope changing hands. The recipients' expressions shifted from congenial to focused as they excused themselves to examine the contents. Margaret's attention darted between Walt's movements and Bob's calm demeanor. Jason, still charming a county commissioner, hadn't noticed the shift in the room's atmosphere. "What are you doing?" Margaret hissed when Bob returned to her side. Her smile remained fixed, but panic flashed in her eyes. "What should have been done weeks ago," Bob replied quietly. By now, several prominent townspeople had opened their envelopes. Hushed conversations erupted in corners. Judge Whitaker's stern gaze found Jason across the room. The bank president whispered urgently to the town attorney. Jason finally sensed something amiss. He excused himself and made his way toward Margaret. Professional smile strained at the edges. "Is there a problem?" he asked under his breath. Before either could respond, Pastor Allen approached, envelope open in his hands, expression grave. "Margaret, Mr. Miles, I believe we need to discuss these documents." The fellowship hall's ambient noise had diminished, conversations dropping to whispers or silence altogether. The Christmas music continued its cheerful melody, now incongruous against the tension. "What documents?" Jason asked, maintaining his composure. "Some misunderstanding, I'm sure." "Copies of the altered will," Bob stated evenly. "Financial transfers prepared without authorization. Evidence of similar patterns in Springvale and Lakeside." Margaret's face drained of color. "Robert, this is hardly the place." "It's exactly the place," Bob countered, voice still low and controlled. "Among people who've known me for 40 years. People who can recognize truth when they see it." Jason's charm hardened into something colder. "These accusations are baseless. Margaret has been concerned about her husband's mental state for months. These documents are likely the product of confusion, possibly even fabricated during his episodes." "The signatures certainly are fabricated," Judge Whitaker interjected, adjusting his glasses as he examined a page. "I've notarized enough of Robert's documents over the years to know his hand." The radiator hissed loudly in the growing silence. Bob stood perfectly still, the eye of a storm gathering around him. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion privately," Jason suggested, glancing at the onlookers. "I think we're past that point," Michael said, stepping forward. "As my father's attorney, I've already filed preliminary documentation with the district attorney's office regarding elder financial abuse, wire fraud, and document falsification." "Your father's attorney?" Margaret repeated, looking at her son with betrayal. "Michael, you can't possibly believe—" "I've seen the evidence, Mom." Michael's voice held both firmness and regret. "I've verified it independently." Jason's expression shifted, calculation replacing confidence. "Robert, be reasonable. Legal proceedings would be lengthy, expensive, publicly damaging. Surely there's a more amicable resolution available." "There was," Bob replied. "6 weeks ago, before you entered my home with my wife's key, before you attempted to dismantle what I've spent a lifetime building." Margaret's composure finally cracked. "You don't understand," she said, voice rising. "We weren't happy, Robert. Years of silence, you buried in work. Jason showed me there could be more." "This was never about happiness," Bob interrupted quietly. "This was about money, my money." The fellowship hall had gone completely silent now. The Christmas carols faded between tracks. Dozens of eyes watched the confrontation unfold, a community bearing witness. Jason attempted to move toward the exit, but Walt stood blocking his path. "Going somewhere?" "This is absurd," Jason declared, looking around for support and finding none. "These allegations are completely—" "Save it for the deposition," Michael cut in. "The forensic accountants have already begun tracing the offshore accounts you established." Something crumbled in Jason's expression, the recognition of a con man who suddenly realizes he's been outplayed. Margaret swayed slightly, reaching for a nearby chair. "What happens now?" she asked, voice small in the silent hall. Bob straightened his tie, a gesture so normal, so characteristic that several onlookers felt a wave of relief at this sign that the Bob Harmon they'd always known remained intact despite everything. "Now," he said simply, "the truth is on record. What follows will be determined by choices, yours, his, and mine." He turned to address the gathered community, his voice steady. "I apologize for bringing this matter into our Christmas gathering. Some situations cannot be resolved in shadow." The silence that followed held no judgment of Bob, only a community's collective breath finally released. Pastor Allen stepped forward, placing a hand on Bob's shoulder. "Perhaps we should take a moment for reflection." He glanced meaningfully at Margaret and Jason. Some private discussions seemed necessary. As the gathering slowly resumed, conversations now hushed and serious, Bob accepted handshakes and quiet words of support from neighbors and friends. The confrontation had passed without raised voices or dramatic scenes, yet its impact rippled through the room like a stone dropped in still water. Later that night, as Michael drove him back to the hardware store apartment, Bob gazed out at the Christmas lights reflecting off snow-covered streets. "You did it," Michael said, "exactly as you planned." "We did what was necessary," Bob corrected. "The rest is still to come." Shortly after midnight, a knock came at the apartment door. Bob opened it to find Margaret standing there, a suitcase at her feet, her face stripped of defiance. "We need to talk," she said. "You should come inside," Bob said, stepping back from the door. "It's cold out there." Margaret entered hesitantly, setting her suitcase by the wall. In the harsh overhead light, she looked older, diminished, makeup hastily applied, hair pulled back without her usual precision. "I didn't know where else to go," she admitted. "Jason's gone. Cleared out his house and left town an hour after the gathering." "Smart man," Bob observed without malice. Margaret sank into the apartment's single armchair. "What happens now, Robert?" Before Bob could answer, footsteps sounded on the stairs. Michael appeared in the doorway, expression hardening at the sight of his mother. "I heard voices," he explained to his father. Margaret looked between them, reality settling in her eyes. "You're working together. All this time." "Hello, Mother," Michael said formally. "I think we should all talk in the morning," Bob suggested. "It's late, and some conversations require clear heads." "No," Margaret's voice sharpened with sudden urgency. "I need to know now. Are you pressing charges? Will there be a trial?" Bob studied his wife of 35 years, seeing past the desperate woman before him to the decades they'd shared, some good, some merely comfortable, none deserving this ending. "That depends on several things," he replied evenly. "Full financial transparency, complete reversal of all transfers, return of original documents." "Of course, yes," she agreed quickly. "And the truth, Margaret, about how it started, how far it went." She glanced at Michael, then back to Bob. "In front of our son?" "I'm his lawyer in this matter," Michael reminded her, voice neutral but firm. "And I've seen most of it already." Margaret's shoulders sagged. "Jason approached me first, at the charity auction in August, said he'd done some research on Harmon Construction, wanted to discuss investment opportunities." Her voice grew smaller. "He made me feel interesting, valuable. The affair, that came later." "And the financial planning?" Bob prompted. "His idea, initially, but She looked away. "I encouraged it. We were unhappy, Robert. Years of silence between us. I convinced myself you owed me something for all that loneliness." Michael shifted uncomfortably, but remained silent. "The falsified will?" Bob asked. "Jason handled that. I didn't know until after—" She trailed off, the lie dying before fully formed. "I knew. I just told myself it was insurance, leverage to make sure I wasn't left with nothing." Bob nodded, accepting her admission without comment. "There will be no criminal charges. Thank God," Margaret breathed. "Provided," Bob continued firmly, "everything is restored within 7 days. Michael will handle the legal documentation, any discrepancies, any hidden accounts, and that changes immediately." "I understand," she whispered. "You should know," Michael added, "that the district attorney has enough to pursue Jason regardless. They've flagged similar cases in 2 other jurisdictions." Margaret's eyes widened. "Will I have to testify?" "Most likely," Michael confirmed. "But as a victim rather than an accomplice, assuming full cooperation now." The small apartment fell silent except for the ticking of the wall clock and the distant sound of a snowplow clearing Main Street. 3 people connected by blood and history, now strangers navigating a new reality. "I'll be staying with my sister in Ohio," Margaret finally said. Until things are settled." Bob nodded. "That seems best." As Michael escorted his mother out to call her a taxi, Bob stood at the window watching snowflakes drift through the streetlight's glow. Not victory, not defeat, just the end of one chapter and the uncertain beginning of another. The legal proceedings moved with surprising efficiency. By Christmas Eve, all assets had been secured, transfers reversed, documentation restored. Margaret had cooperated fully, whether from remorse or self-preservation remained unclear. Bob reclaimed his house on the hill, though its rooms echoed differently now. Michael stayed through the holidays, occupying his old bedroom as they established a new rhythm: coffee together in the mornings, quiet dinners where conversation gradually moved beyond the immediate crisis to bridge years of distance. The town absorbed the scandal as small towns do, initial whispers giving way to practical support. Mrs. Davidson from the bakery accidentally made extra sourdough loaves and insisted Bob take them. Walt organized a rotating schedule of visitors dropping by with casseroles and news. Judge Whitaker made a point of asking Bob's opinion about courthouse renovation plans at the diner, loudly enough for everyone to hear. 3 days after Christmas, Michael found Bob in the garage, sorting through fishing tackle. "Planning an expedition?" Michael asked, leaning against the workbench. "Thinking about the cabin," Bob replied. "Roof probably needs work after the heavy snows." "The old place up by Miller's Creek? I'm surprised you kept it." Bob closed the tackle box. "Never could bring myself to sell it. Your mother wanted to, especially after you stopped coming home." Michael nodded, understanding the unspoken meaning. The cabin had been their place. Fishing trips, summer projects, the rare occasions when Bob's focus shifted entirely to his son. "Probably needs more than just roof work after all these years," Michael observed. "Probably does," Bob agreed. "I've got 2 weeks before I need to be back in Boston." Their eyes met briefly, decades of misunderstanding giving way to a tentative new foundation. "Could use the help," Bob acknowledged. January brought a brief thaw, enough to make the narrow road to the cabin passable. Bob's truck navigated the familiar turns, Michael beside him, checking a list of supplies they'd packed. The cabin stood much as they'd left it years ago: weathered gray boards, small porch sagging slightly, windows reflecting the pale winter sun. Not abandoned, but neglected, waiting. "Worse than I expected," Michael admitted as they surveyed broken gutters and missing shingles. "Better than it could be," Bob countered. "Structure's sound. Everything else can be fixed." They worked through the afternoon, clearing debris, assessing damage, making plans. The physical labor loosened something between them, allowing conversations that had been impossible across polished dining tables and lawyers' desks. As the sun began to set, they sat on the porch steps, steam rising from coffee mugs. In the valley below, the town's lights twinkled on one by one. "You could have destroyed her," Michael said finally. "Legally, I mean. Full prosecution." Bob watched a hawk circle lazily above the tree line. "Wouldn't have fixed anything." "Still, after what she did..." 35 years counts for something," Bob replied. "Even at the end." They sat in companionable silence as twilight deepened around them. Not everything repaired, but enough to build upon. "I've been thinking," Bob said finally. "Cabin needs more than repairs. Might be time for an addition. Extra bedroom, maybe a proper kitchen." Michael understood his father was talking about more than just the cabin. "I'd like that," he said quietly. "A place to come back to." The last light faded from the western sky as father and son contemplated foundations, those broken and those yet to be built. Spring came early that year. By mid-March, the last patches of snow were retreating beneath a strengthening sun, revealing muddy earth studded with the first tentative green shoots. At the cabin, Bob and Michael worked side by side, reviewing blueprints spread across a weathered picnic table on the newly rebuilt porch. "Addition's going to change the whole character of the place," Bob observed, tracing the outline with a calloused finger. Coffee steam rose between them, carrying the rich aroma that had punctuated their morning conversations for months now. "That's the point, isn't it?" Michael asked. "Building something new while keeping what's worth keeping." Bob nodded, watching a last chunk of icicle surrender to the warmth and drop from the eave. The sound of its landing marked another small ending, another small beginning. "You know," Bob said, "when I first started building, old Tom Whitaker gave me advice I never forgot. Said there's 2 approaches when a structure gets damaged: patch the obvious holes and hope it holds, or look deeper at the foundation." Michael waited, knowing his father's rhythms now, the thoughtful pauses between insights. "Whole time this was happening with your mother, people kept asking why I wasn't angrier, why I didn't want revenge." Bob sipped his coffee, gaze drifting toward the valley where distant church bells marked the hour. "Truth is, anger's just patching holes. Doesn't fix what matters underneath." "The foundation," Michael supplied. "Exactly. Some structures can't be saved once the foundation cracks. Doesn't mean you wasted your time building them. Just means you salvage the good materials and start again on solid ground." They fell quiet, listening to chickadees calling from nearby pines. The coffee pot on the camp stove sent up its last wisps of steam. "You ever regret it?" Michael finally asked. "All those years?" Bob considered the question with the same care he'd give to measuring a load-bearing beam. "Can't regret what gave me you. Can't regret work that still stands around town. Rest of it," he shrugged, "just becomes part of who you are, like growth rings in good timber." Michael nodded, understanding more than words could capture. Below them, in the greening valley, life continued, unchanging in its rhythms, yet never quite the same. "Think we can finish the edition by summer?" Michael asked, changing the subject, yet not really changing it at all. "Depends," Bob replied, the hint of a smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. "You planning on being around that long?" "Got some vacation time saved up," Michael said. "Might be time to use it." Bob nodded, satisfaction settling around him like a comfortable old coat. He stood, stretching his back, and looked out over the valley where he'd spent his life building things meant to last. The last snow was melting. The plans for tomorrow lay ready. Some things couldn't be rebuilt, but some things could be built better.